The conference room on the 32nd floor of the Alderton Group's Chicago headquarters wasn't the biggest room Shepard Cole had ever stood in. But it was the coldest, not in temperature, though the air conditioning ran aggressive enough to make you forget it was July outside. Cold in the way that only certain rooms could be. The ones where the furniture cost more than most people earned in a year, and the people sitting in it knew it. Shepard had driven 4 hours from Indianapolis that morning. Left before dawn. Made coffee in the dark while his 9-year-old son, Finn, slept with one arm hanging off the mattress and a soccer cleat still on his left foot from the night before. He hadn't woken him, just pulled the blanket up, grabbed his bag, and walked out into the empty street where the world hadn't started yet. Now he stood at the end of a table that seated 12, though only 6 of the Alderton family had bothered to show up. 6 was enough. Reginald Alderton at the head, 80 years old, and somehow still the sharpest thing in the room. His son, Clifton, to his right, the kind of man who had inherited his father's instincts but none of his patience. Clifton's wife, Sylvana, who hadn't spoken yet but whose eyes hadn't left Shepard since he walked in. 2 lawyers, 1 financial advisor who hadn't looked up from his laptop since the meeting began, and on the table between them a document that was 47 pages long, which Shepard had read 3 times on the drive up, pulled over twice to reread specific sections, and still couldn't fully believe was real. $62 million. The number sounded different in a room like this. Quieter, somehow. More dangerous. The Alderton Group wanted to acquire Shepard's logistics company, Summit Freight, which he had built over 9 years from a single cargo van and a borrowed warehouse space on the east side of Indianapolis into a regional operation running 42 routes across 6 states. It wasn't a tech unicorn. It wasn't a name anyone outside the Midwest supply chain world would recognize, but it moved things. Medical equipment to rural hospitals. Emergency supplies to flooded counties. Food distribution for 3 school lunch programs that would have collapsed without it. It worked because Shepard had built it to work, not to be sold. Clifton Alderton leaned forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular flatness of someone accustomed to rooms where no one interrupted him. "The offer is generous given your current margins," he said. "You've done well for someone in your position, but Summit is a regional player operating on regional logic, and we have national infrastructure you simply don't have access to. We're offering you liquidity, stability, and an exit that most owners in your space never see." He paused there, just long enough. "Of course, day-to-day management would transition to our operations team. You'd retain a founder title through the end of the integration period." A founder title, through the end of the integration period. Shepard read that phrase 3 times in the contract, too. It meant 18 months. It meant a nameplate and a parking spot and no actual authority over anything. It meant they would take the company he built and absorb it into something so large it would disappear entirely. The routes renamed, the drivers reallocated, the relationships he had spent nearly a decade building dissolved into a spreadsheet somewhere. He looked down at the document. Then he looked up at Reginald Alderton, who hadn't spoken yet and showed no intention of speaking, and whose expression had the quality of a man watching something small try to climb something tall. "You bootstrapped this, didn't you?" Clifton said. "It wasn't a question, no institutional backing, no Series A. You drove the routes yourself in the early years." Another pause. Admirable, genuinely. But men who build things the hard way sometimes mistake stubbornness for vision. What you've built is solid, it's not scalable, and you're not the person to take it where it needs to go. Sylvana Alderton finally spoke. Her voice was smooth, unhurried, the kind of voice that had never needed to be loud to be heard. "We're not taking anything from you, Mr. Cole. We're offering you a way out before the market decides it for you." The room was quiet after that. Shepard had expected a hard pitch. He had not expected this particular flavor of it, the kind that came wrapped in what sounded like advice, like concern, like they were doing him a favor by reducing him. He had sat across from difficult people before. Creditors when he was 90 days late on a loan in year 3. A competitor who tried to poach his 3 best drivers on the same weekend. A city inspector who told him his warehouse wasn't going to pass until it did. None of it had felt like this. This felt like being assessed. Like they had already decided what he was, and were just waiting for him to confirm it. His hand moved without thinking. Just a small reach into his jacket pocket where his phone sat face down, and when his fingers touched the edge of it, he stopped. He didn't pull it out. But he knew what was on the lock screen because he had set it himself 6 months ago and hadn't changed it since. A photo he'd taken on a Tuesday evening at the park near their apartment. Finn standing at the top of the climbing structure with both arms out like he was about to fly, laughing at something off camera. Just a kid. Just a regular Tuesday. Shepard left the phone in his pocket. But something had already shifted. He looked back at the document, then at the table, then at Clifton Alderton, who was watching him with the patient confidence of someone who had done this before and knew how it ended. "I appreciate the offer," Shepard said. His voice was even, not aggressive, not shaky, just even. "But I'm going to decline." The room didn't explode. That was the strange part. Clifton blinked once, a slight recalibration. The financial advisor finally looked up from his laptop. Silvana's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind her eyes did. A small tightening, the way a person's looks when they've touched something they expected to move and it didn't. Reginald Alderton spoke for the first time. His voice was lower than Shepard expected and slower, like each word was worth something and he was spending them carefully. "Young man," he said, "you should think about what you're walking away from." Shepard met his eyes. "I have," he said. "I've also thought about what I'd be walking into." He closed the document, slid it back across the table, picked up his bag, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the door. No one stopped him. The elevator down felt longer than it should have. The lobby felt cavernous. Outside, the July heat hit him like a wall after the artificial cold of the 32nd floor, and he stood on the sidewalk for a second, just standing there, while Chicago moved around him completely indifferent to the fact that he had just turned down $62 million. His phone buzzed. A text from Finn's summer program counselor reminding him that pickup was at 4, and they were doing the water balloon thing again today, so to bring a change of clothes. He stood there reading it for a moment longer than necessary. Then he tucked the phone away, walked to the parking garage, and started the drive home. He made it 40 minutes before the calls started. His operations manager, Deb, called twice before he picked up. Her voice was tight in the way she only got when something had already gone sideways. "Tell me what happened," she said. "I turned it down." Silence. Then, "Shep." "I turned it down, Deb." "The whole thing?" "The whole thing." Another silence, longer this time, the kind that meant she was doing math in her head, running numbers she already knew by heart. Deb had been with Summit since year 2. She knew the margins better than he did. She knew what the next 18 months looked like if nothing changed. Not catastrophic, but thin. Too thin to absorb a real shock. And the Alderton Group was nothing if not a real shock waiting to happen. "Okay," she said finally. "Not agreement. Just acknowledgement. I'll hold things together until you're back." His driver, Marco, called next. Then a message from the warehouse supervisor in Fort Wayne. Then a former competitor who had somehow already heard and sent a single text that read smart or stupid, either way, respect. By the time Shepard pulled into the parking lot of Finn's summer program, his voicemail was full, and his chest felt like something heavy had settled into it and was slowly making itself at home. Finn was the last kid out the door as usual, trailing a backpack that looked roughly the same size he was, a popsicle stick in one hand and a friendship bracelet he'd made in art on the other wrist. He saw Shepard's car and ran, the way he always ran, like the distance between them was an emergency. "Dad," he hit the side of the car with both palms before Shepard even had the door fully open. "I made a bracelet. I made one for you too, but I left it inside. Can we go get it?" Shepard looked at him. This kid. This absolutely regular, beautiful, chaotic kid who still had a streak of purple from a marker on his forearm and didn't know it. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go get it." They went back inside. Retrieved the bracelet, which was green and blue and slightly lopsided, and which Finn insisted on tying onto Shepard's wrist right there in the hallway while the custodian swept around them. "How was your thing?" Finn asked, not looking up from the bracelet knot. "Hard. Did you win?" Shepard looked down at the top of his son's head, at the way his hair needed a cut again, at the careful way he was tying the knot like it mattered enormously that it stayed. "I made a decision," Shepard said. Finn looked up. "Is that the same thing?" "Sometimes." Finn considered that, then nodded like it was a satisfying enough answer and went back to the knot. They ate dinner that night at home, pasta, because Finn had requested pasta for approximately 37 consecutive days, and Shepard had stopped arguing with that particular hill. While Finn ate, he talked about the water balloon activity, about a kid named Carson who had nailed him in the ear from 20 feet, about a caterpillar he'd found near the fence that he was considering naming Gerald. Shepard ate and listened and said the right things in the right places and did not check his phone once. It was only after Finn fell asleep, sprawled diagonally across his bed in a way that defied geometry, one arm around a stuffed bear he still slept with but would deny to anyone who asked, that Shepard sat down at the kitchen table with his laptop and let himself look at what was coming. It wasn't good. The Alderton Group moved fast. He hadn't expected that. By morning, 2 of his regional partners had received calls from Alderton subsidiaries, courtesy calls, friendly conversations, the kind that didn't say anything directly but made the situation clear. One of them, a distribution hub in Dayton he'd worked with for 4 years, sent him an email at midnight that was 3 sentences long and said nothing except that they needed to revisit terms on the existing arrangement. By the next afternoon, a trucking association he'd been in talks with for a contract had gone quiet. No explanation, just quiet, he told Deb she already knew. "They're not going to come at you directly," she said, sitting across from him in his office, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug she wasn't drinking from. "They're just going to make it uncomfortable for everyone around you until the uncomfortable becomes unbearable." "I know." "How long do you think it takes?" "For what? For someone we actually need to walk." He didn't answer that, because he didn't know, and saying he didn't know out loud felt like the kind of thing you couldn't take back. 3 days later, it was the Fort Wayne account. A meeting scheduled, then postponed, then quietly canceled with no new date proposed. Shepard had built that account personally. 3 years of reliability, of showing up when they said he would, of covering shortfalls at his own cost twice when a weather event disrupted their normal carrier. None of that showed up in the cancellation email. Just regrets and the phrase, "circumstances have shifted." He drove to Fort Wayne. Sat across from their operations director, a woman named Patricia, who had always been straight with him, and listened to her explain carefully that they had received a better structured offer and that this wasn't personal. "Who from?" he asked. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. He drove home with the windows down because the AC in his truck was making a sound that suggested it was about 6 weeks from dying, and he hadn't budgeted the repair yet, and that fact felt smaller and larger than it should have at the same time. Finn called him on the drive just to ask if they could have tacos instead of pasta. "Yes," Shepard said. "We can have tacos." "Yes." A pause. "Are you okay?" "You sound weird." "I'm fine. Just driving." "Okay." Another pause. "Gerald is doing good, by the way. I moved him to a jar. Good call. I gave him a leaf." He seemed happy. Shepard felt something move in his chest, loose and unexpected. "That's really good, buddy." "Okay, see you when you get home." The call ended. Shepard drove another mile before he pulled over in the parking lot of a closed hardware store and sat there for a few minutes, not doing anything in particular. Just sitting. Just breathing. Just reminding himself of the specific weight of things that were worth fighting for, which sometimes you needed to do quietly and alone before you could go back to fighting for them loudly. The thing about Shepard Cole that the Alderton Group didn't know, couldn't know, because they had looked at his financials and his route maps and his growth projections but had not looked at his people, was that he had spent 9 years building something that wasn't fully visible in any spreadsheet. The drivers knew him, not as a name on a paycheck, but as someone who had shown up at a hospital at 2 in the morning when one of them had a cardiac event on a route, stayed until the family arrived, covered the man's shifts out of his own pocket for 6 weeks until he recovered. The warehouse coordinators knew him as someone who remembered their kids' names and their anniversaries of joining the team, and who had twice delayed his own salary to make sure no one else missed theirs. There were 31 people who had been with Summit Freight for more than 5 years. 31 people in a small regional logistics company, in an industry with one of the highest turnover rates in the country. That number didn't appear anywhere in the document the Alderton Group had prepared. It wasn't a line item, it couldn't be quantified. But it was real, and it was what Shepard built his next move on. He didn't announce anything, didn't call a staff meeting or send an all-hands email. He made 12 phone calls in 2 days, to account managers, to long-standing clients, to 2 trucking cooperatives he had maintained quiet relationships with for years without formalizing anything because the timing hadn't been right. He talked straight with each of them, told them what was happening, what the Alderton Group was doing, what the next few months might look like if he lost the pressure campaign. And then he told them what he was building instead. Not just a defense, an alternative, a cooperative operating structure, not a merger, not an acquisition, but a formal network of independent regional carriers with shared infrastructure, shared data systems, and collective bargaining power on the contracts that individual companies couldn't win alone. He had been sketching the architecture of it for almost 2 years, never the right moment, always one more thing to stabilize first. The Alderton Group, without knowing it, had given him the deadline he needed to stop waiting. 2 of the cooperatives said yes before he'd finished talking. A third said they needed a week and called back in 4 days. One of the lost accounts, not Fort Wayne, a different one, a medical distribution client out of Columbus, reached back out on their own, said they had heard what was happening and wanted to know more about the new structure. It wasn't clean. It wasn't fast. There were nights when he sat at that kitchen table until 2 in the morning, with a legal pad covered in logistics and liability questions he didn't have answers to yet, And there were mornings when Finn came out for breakfast and Shepard had been awake so long that the day felt like it was already collapsing before it started. But it was real. That was the thing. Every piece of it was something he had actually built, actually earned, actually knew how to defend. 6 weeks after he walked out of the Alderton Group's conference room, he received an invitation. Not a demand, not an ultimatum. An invitation. A request for a follow-up conversation at their convenience, at a location of his choosing, at a time that worked for his schedule. He chose Indianapolis. They came to him. The meeting was in a conference room at a hotel 2 miles from his warehouse. Smaller room, no view. Clifton Alderton arrived with a different lawyer and a different energy. Still controlled, still careful. But there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there before. Something that looked, if you watch closely enough, like recalculation. Shepard arrived 5 minutes early. Set his laptop open on the table. Did not stand when they walked in. Clifton sat across from him, folded his hands, and said, "You've been busy." "So have you," Shepard said. A beat. "What you're building with the cooperative is interesting," Clifton said. The word interesting doing a lot of work to cover something that was closer to inconvenient. "It's not interesting," Shepard said. "It's operational. It'll be fully structured by Q1. Clifton glanced at the lawyer, who did not visibly react. "The original offer is still on the table," Clifton said. "I know, we're prepared to discuss modified terms, more favorable transition provisions, a longer founder involvement period." Shepard nodded slowly. "What does involvement mean in those terms? Meaningful input on regional—" "What does it mean?" Shepard said again without raising his voice. "Specifically, voting rights, operational, veto, personnel authority. What does it mean?" The silence that followed was different from the one in Chicago. That silence had been comfortable, theirs. This one wasn't anyone's. This one sat in the middle of the table like something neither of them owned. Clifton said, "We could discuss a seat on the integration committee." "No," Shepard said, not angry, just clear. Clifton looked at him for a long moment. What would it take? Shepard had thought about that question for 6 weeks. Not obsessively, not with bitterness, but methodically the way he thought about route efficiency and weather contingencies. Clearly from first principles. "Summit stays Summit," he said. "Its own entity, its own name, its own decision-making structure. A formal partnership agreement with Alderton for shared contracts where both parties benefit, structured as equals, not absorption. And the people who have been with me stay with me on my terms, not yours." Clifton sat back slightly. "That's not an acquisition." "No," Shepard said. "It isn't." Another silence. Clifton exchanged a look with the lawyer that Shepard didn't try to read. Sylvana Alderton wasn't in this meeting. Reginald wasn't either. Shepard had wondered about that, and now he thought he understood it. They had sent Clifton. That meant something. It meant the conversation was real in a way the first one hadn't been. "I need to bring this back," Clifton said finally. "Take the time you need," Shepard said. He drove home from that meeting at 3 in the afternoon, which meant he got to Finn's summer program before pickup, which almost never happened. He sat in the parking lot in the heat with the engine off and the windows down, watching the kids on the field, until he spotted Finn near the fence with his hand cupped around something, showing it to 2 other kids who were leaning in to look. Gerald, probably. Or possibly a new caterpillar. It was that kind of summer. He got out of the car and walked to the gate, and the moment Finn looked up and saw him, that particular way a kid's face reorganizes itself around the presence of the person they trust most in the world. Shepard felt something release in his chest that he hadn't realized he'd been holding on to. "You're early," Finn said, surprised. Meeting ended. Really looked, in that direct way kids had before they learned to be polite about looking. "How'd it go?" Shepard crouched down to his level. "It went the way it needed to." Finn considered that. "Is that good?" "Yeah," Shepard said. "I think it actually is." Finn nodded, satisfied, then held out his cupped hands. Inside, resting on a folded piece of paper towel, was a caterpillar that was not Gerald. Gerald, apparently, had graduated to a chrysalis and was resting peacefully in his jar at home. "This is Gerald Jr., Finn announced. He needed someone. Shepard looked at the caterpillar, then at his son. Of course he did. They walked to the car together. Finn talking steadily about Gerald Jr.'s likely diet, and whether caterpillars had feelings and whether feelings were the same as opinions, and Shepard walked beside him in the summer heat and listened to every word. 3 weeks later, the Alderton Group came back with a counter. Not the partnership he had proposed, not yet, but a significant step toward it. A joint operating agreement on 4 specific contract corridors, renewable annually, with Summit retaining full personnel and branding control. A pilot, essentially. A way for both sides to see what working together looked like when it wasn't a takeover. It wasn't the 62 million. It wasn't going to make him wealthy in the way that Number might have, but Summit Freight would still be Summit Freight. The drivers would still be his drivers. The routes he had built in the dark before anyone believed they were worth building would still carry his name. Deb read through the counter that evening at his kitchen table while Finn did homework at the other end and intermittently narrated updates about Gerald Jr.'s progress, which had apparently been significant. "It's real," she said finally, looking up. "It's actually a real thing." "Yeah, how'd you know they'd come back?" Shepard thought about that. "I didn't," he said. "I knew we'd built something worth coming back for. I figured that would eventually matter more than the pressure they were applying." Deb looked at him for a moment. "You figured, I figured." She shook her head, but there was something in the expression that wasn't quite frustration anymore. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I'll draft the response." Later that night, after Finn was in bed and the apartment was quiet, Shepard sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while. Not working, just sitting. The bracelet Finn had made him was still on his wrist, green and blue, slightly lopsided. The knot had held. He thought about the morning he had driven to Chicago before dawn, making coffee in the dark while his kids slept with a soccer cleat on, about the conference room on the 32nd floor, and the way Clifton Alderton's voice had carried the absolute certainty that he already knew how this ended, about the drive home and the pasta and the friendship bracelet, and Gerald the caterpillar, and the 12 phone calls and the legal pad and the 2 a.m. nights and the parking lot in Fort Wayne, where he sat and breathed until he remembered what he was fighting for. He thought about the fact that none of that was visible in any document. None of it could be priced or projected or put in a quarterly report. And yet all of it had mattered, had been in the end the whole thing. A single light was on in the kitchen. Somewhere on the street outside, a car went past. The refrigerator hummed. Shepard Cole did not feel like a man who had won something. He felt like a man who had not lost himself in the middle of trying to build something, and understood more clearly now than he ever had before that these were not the same thing. The first was about outcome. The second was about who you remained when the outcome wasn't guaranteed. And in the morning he knew Finn would want to show him Gerald Jr.'s progress, and then they would have breakfast and argue mildly about whether today counted as a pasta day, and Shepard would have emails to answer and calls to make and a company to run that was still his to run. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.